everyone. Welcome to Steward Observatory for an exceptional presentation tonight. The DESI, which stands for Dark Energy Spectroscopic Instrument, the consortium that runs that instrument was supposed to have a meeting this week in Tucson, and because of what's going on in the news, of course, they canceled it. They've done it virtually. They did it by telephone today. But you know what? We could still do the public lecture. So, and we are. And we're recording it, so the members of the DESI Consortium can also watch the public lecture. So we welcome you, and we welcome all of you on the World Wide Web watching our public evening lecture tonight from Steward Observatory. The bad news, I actually did schedule an undergraduate telescope operator to run the telescope tonight, but it's cloudy, right? So telescope's not open. I brought my stamp. You can't even see the moon through clouds. I brought my stamp. If there are any students here, I know it's spring break, but if there are any students here for an assignment, I'll be at this table at the conclusion of question and answer to stamp your assignments. I will also remind you that our next lecture next week is every semester we give a lecture in Spanish. And so our Bach Fellow, Cristobal, is going to give a talk on extrasolar planets, but it will be in Spanish here at 7:30 next Monday. So tonight we are welcoming two of our colleagues from across the street. I was just telling some of you today, we call it Kitt Peak. I've been here since 1982, and we just always call that building Kitt Peak. But of course, then people think that we're talking about the mountain. It used to be called the National Optical Astronomy Observatory. It now has a new name, National Science Foundation Optical Infrared Lab. But it is at the 4-meter telescope that this particular instrument resides at Kitt Peak. And so from the NSF's Optical and Infrared Lab, we welcome today, first of all, Dr. Aaron Meisner. Dr. Meisner received his bachelor's degree in physics from Stanford, and then he received his PhD in physics from Harvard. And then our second speaker, who will take over midway through, is Dr. Parker Fagrelius. Did I get that right? Fagrelius, all right. And she received her bachelor's degree in physics from Dartmouth in Hanover, New Hampshire. And then she received her PhD, was Berkeley, right? Yeah, at University of California, Berkeley, she received her PhD. And I believe Aaron, after he left Harvard, was at Berkeley. But they have both just recently arrived in Tucson and are working at the National Observatory across the street. As you'll see, we do have a very active amateur astronomy and Friends of Astronomy program here in Southern Arizona. And so without further ado, I will bring down the lights and ask Aaron to start the presentation about DESI, a new 3D cosmic map to study dark energy.
Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction. About DESI, a new 3D cosmic map to study dark energy, which is a new program getting underway, just about an hour and 15 minutes away from here, up at Kitt Peak at the Mail Telescope. So what is DESI and why are we talking about it now? It's, as Tom said, it's an acronym. Astronomers really like acronyms. It stands for Dark Energy Spectroscopic Instrument, so we're saving a lot of syllables with this acronym. And in a sentence, it's a new spectrograph for Kitt Peak's 4-meter Mail Telescope. So the Mail Telescope has been around for about 50 years now, and even so, it's still really a state-of-the-art facility, and Kitt Peak is really a world-class observing site in terms of the conditions that you achieve there. So in combination with this new technologically advanced system called DESI, the spectrograph that we've just installed, this is really a premier research facility that's going to be operating in full swing for the next 5 years up at Kitt Peak. And as the name suggests, DESI is about spectroscopy, which basically just means splitting up light from galaxies and stars that come into your telescope into its constituent colors to measure how bright the objects are as a function of their color, which gives us really a wealth of information about them. And so in my talk, I'll sort of discuss the overview and motivation for why we want to do all of this in the first place. And then Parker will go into details about the new hardware that we've worked very hard to install. And what you can see here on this side is a cutaway showing some of the key pieces of hardware that have been installed over the past couple years. So we completely replaced the top end of the telescope, and below we put in a bunch of new detectors to measure the light. So even though the place and the thing that make up DESI are really cool, DESI is actually a lot more than that. It's really a very ambitious mission consisting of many hundreds of astronomers from all over the world who have banded together to try to make our next big leap in understanding the composition and the evolution of the universe. And we call this sort of subfield that's at the intersection of astronomy and physics, cosmology. And within this subfield of cosmology, DESI has a couple of very specific questions that it's really looking to investigate. And I'll get into more of some of these terms later, but these are: what is dark energy? You might have guessed that from dark energy being in the name of the project. What is dark matter? And is our theory of gravity, general relativity right, or does it change on the larger scales in the universe? And so the way that we get at all these questions is by mapping the universe in 3 dimensions with DESI, and we're doing that, about a factor of 10 times better than has ever been done before. So as scientists, our job is to start looking into investigating questions that we don't know the answers to, like dark matter and dark energy, but we begin with what we do know, and the things that we do know and recognize are what we call ordinary matter. So this is the things that are made up of protons, neutrons, electrons, and as you build up from the smallest subatomic particles, you get atoms and then molecules. I believe this picture is a caffeine molecule. And then these building blocks of atoms, molecules, and so forth make up everything that we can see and that we interact with in our day-to-day existence, including everyday objects, but then also the planets. So even though exoplanets are a really big, popular, trendy topic in astronomy today, we sort of fundamentally understand what they're made of. It's just, water and hydrogen, helium, things like that, iron. Going up in size further, things like stars, the sun being a prime example there. Going even bigger now, galaxies. So when we look at galaxies like the Milky Way, but very far across the universe, we see large numbers of stars in them is how we detect that the galaxies are there, and typically they can have something like 100 billion stars that we're seeing together in each galaxy, which help us detect them very far away. And actually this picture was taken with some of the new hardware last spring on Kit Peake's Mayall telescope. So this was when we had installed the new optic system, and just as an engineering test, we put some commercial cameras behind that to see if we could get a clear picture. And this was what we got on the very first night. A really crisp image of M31. So this was probably something like a 20-second exposure on the 4-meter telescope. Moving up to even bigger scales than just single galaxies, from previous experiments and astronomy projects, we already know that there are galaxies everywhere, if we look out far enough to see them. And they form this vast sort of filamentary, what's called a cosmic web, where they're sort of dotting the sky, and they look pretty random, but they're not totally random. You can see that there's little overdensities and underdensities mixed in here in a sort of filamentary web-like structure. So what shapes this cosmic web that we see today in astronomy projects like DESI? And the answer is the entire history of the universe up until this point right now. And the way that we currently understand the universe as physicists and astronomers is that it started with a big bang. So the universe started out very small, very hot, and very dense, and then all of a sudden underwent a very rapid period of expansion, and that expansion continues today. And so at early times, it was so hot and dense that it was sort of like a fluid of subatomic particles. And then gradually, as it expanded, it cooled down, and you started to see things that are more familiar to us today, like the first stars, the first galaxies. The universe underwent a peak epoch of formation of stars and galaxies, a few billion years in. And then, even still, after all that, the universe just continues to expand to this day, which is something like 13.8 billion years since the Big Bang, as we stand right now. So, try to play a video here. So, right. You can try to. So this video is going to show what you see in the time there is time 0 to time 1, so you can think of that as very early in the universe until now. And what you see is that the universe started out as this dense fluid that was pretty homogeneous and had very minimal fluctuations in its density, but then over time, the little fluctuations in the density that were there very early on grow into this filamentary web-like structure that I mentioned before and collapse into what are galaxy clusters there at the very end. And so, as it says in the text here, small clumps grow into larger clumps on sort of billion-year timescales. So we couldn't actually see a movie like that by just using our telescopes nowadays. You have to simulate it, so that comes from a simulation. And then, practically speaking, as astronomers, we have to sort of take a snapshot now and try to compare to things like those simulations to understand how this actually played out, or we think it played out over these billions of years. And some galaxies become bigger by merging, and then galaxies themselves can merge into what are called small groups, and then eventually galaxy clusters even. So we do know a fair bit already about cosmic structure from all of the prior work that's been done by astronomers and physicists. And we've learned a lot, we've mapped a lot, we've discovered a lot, but there's also a lot that's unknown. So there's a couple really interesting things coming back to dark matter and dark energy, which I mentioned previously. But one of the big things that is noticed in galaxy surveys is that galaxies and clusters are moving too fast relative to the amount of light that we see, so the amount of ordinary matter that we can see coming from them. And that means that there must be a lot of gravitating, what we call dark matter, that is mixed in with the normal matter in a way that's holding these galaxies together, because otherwise they would just fly apart if only the stars were really there. And then the second really big mystery is that not only is the universe expanding today, still after the Big Bang, but it's actually expanding at an accelerating rate. And so, even as a physicist, you might find that somewhat counterintuitive, because if the universe sort of started out this initial expansion, well, it has a lot of matter and mass in it. So your default assumption might have been that over time it actually slows down as the gravity starts to pull things in together and rein things in a little bit. And actually, we see the opposite. And that is a really big mystery, which came to light about 20-ish years ago in the late 90s. It was the subject of a Nobel Prize in 2011. It was discovered based on supernova, and the term for this is now called dark energy, where there's some mysterious sort of energy, you can think of it as, where it's, instead of acting like gravity to pull things together as you normally would expect, it actually has the exact opposite effect of pushing things apart. And that's a big component of the energy density of our universe today. Just to show that in sort of a little bit more of a quantitative sense, and to show how much of a problem we have in our lack of understanding of these concepts of dark matter and dark energy, which we don't know what they are. The normal matter that I talked about, things like atoms, make up something like 5% of the energy density of the universe today. And dark matter by itself is something like 5 times more of the energy density than the normal matter. And then dark energy is 3 times more than the dark matter. And so all that combines to say that only about 1/20th of the energy density of the universe today is stuff that we actually understand. And the way that you can sort of compare things like atoms and energy in plots like this is Einstein's principle of E equals mc squared, right? So that's sort of how we put it all into one summary pie chart like that. So looking as astronomers to do the next best thing in trying to understand these mysteries and trying to map the universe, how can we best map cosmic structure? And it would be great if we could just capture some dark energy in the lab or capture some dark matter in the lab, but that's not really how it works. Unfortunately, we also can't see it. That's kind of why we put dark in the name of it. But what we are fortunate to have is that the galaxies in this cosmic web are tracing the underlying dark matter filaments. So sort of the darker diffuse parts here are filaments of dark matter making up the cosmic web. But then in the densest parts of them, you also get galaxies that have formed together. And so we can do a pretty good job of tracing out the cosmic web using the stuff we can see, even though it's largely made of the stuff we can't see. And that's a big help to us. Otherwise, we'd be pretty lost. So going into a little more detail, the things that we can see that do trace the cosmic structure on large scales are distant galaxies. And so there are different ways of mapping distant galaxies. And the fundamental sort of distinction I want to draw here is between mapping them in 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions. So anyone can map the sky in 2 dimensions if you just go outside on a non-cloudy night here in Tucson. Thankfully, we have very dark skies and see lots of stars. And so in astronomy, we can do things like just take a lot of very sensitive pictures of the sky and make a 2D map. The issue with 2D mapping is that it has some pretty severe limitations to what we can do with it. One of them being, how do you know just from a 2-dimensional picture of the sky which are actually the stars and which are actually the galaxies? So that's a big problem, number one. And number two is that if you want to map the structure of the universe, you really want to know the 3-dimensional structure of it, because if 2 things are nearby each other on the sky, that doesn't necessarily mean they're actually nearby each other in real 3-dimensional space. So we really want that 3rd dimension, and it really is critical. So with just 2D images, I thought this was kind of a fun example. These are some of the images that we use to actually select what DESI will look at over the next 5 years. You can sometimes, with 2D images alone, guess when you have objects that are actually near each other in 3-dimensional space. So these 2 arrows here point to 2 fuzzy galaxies. They look pretty similar. They have similar colors, similar sizes. They're similarly fuzzy. They're right next to each other on the sky. And indeed, we have some extra follow-up information about these galaxies, and it shows that they're 2 members of the exact same galaxy cluster. So there's a case where you can guess right. But that's not always the case. So here's an example I like to show from a different piece of the sky. These 2 sources, to me, I'm a professional astronomer. I spend lots and lots of my time staring at pictures like this. They look quite similar to me, and one might guess that these are just a pair of companion stars going through the Milky Way together in our own home galaxy, because that is quite a common thing to happen. But actually, you would be very, very horribly wrong if you were to try to infer that just from this 2-dimensional image alone. So one of these objects is what we call a quasar. It's a very luminous type of galaxy, and the other is indeed a star in our own galaxy. And so they're actually a factor of 5 million difference in how distant one is from the other. So we don't want to be making that mistake most of the time when we try to build a map of the structure of the universe. So the great thing about DESI, like other modern astronomy experiments, a lot of them are really about getting at the 3rd dimension one way or another. There's a big premium on that. And DESI is one of these that is giving us the 3rd dimension for, as Parker will talk about, something like 35 million very distant galaxies. And so the way that DESI does this is because it's measuring not just the images, but it's actually getting the spectra, so the light as a function of wavelength for all of these galaxies. And when you have that, you can see sort of the emission or absorption lines, like the sun has helium in it, for example. You can see that, and you can see how they're shifted relative to what you would have, say, in the sun or from the Milky Way galaxy. And so that tells us effectively the Doppler shift of that galaxy, how fast it's moving away from us as a result of the cosmic expansion. And so, you can think of this just like if you have a sort of a first response emergency vehicle going by you on the street and you're on the sidewalk, and it's coming real fast towards you, and you hear its siren sort of sounds higher pitched, and then as it goes by you, the pitch of that siren goes gradually down until it sounds a lower pitch when it's going away from you instead of towards you. And that's essentially what you have here with the galaxies and the way that DESI is measuring how fast they're moving away from us. Except with DESI, we don't have sound waves because the sound waves aren't able to travel through space, but we use light waves, and so the spectra are what gives us the Doppler velocity of these galaxies, which is what we call in astronomy the redshift, or Z is how we denote it. And so a redshift is a proxy for both distance and time. So if something is receding away from us at a faster speed, that means it's more distant from us. And because it's more distant from us, that also means we had to look back further in time to see it, right? The light from it had to travel potentially something like 1 billion years to reach us. So we're looking something like 1 billion years back into the past history of the universe by seeing these, what we call high redshift, or very distant galaxies that DESI is able to detect. So there are a few little warnings about this. Redshift isn't a true distance, right? I think ideally we'd have, a 3D printed model of exactly where everything is relative to each other. And it's nice to have this redshift, which sort of tells you whether one thing is further from you than another. That's very helpful. But it's still not a real distance. And so we need to think a little bit more carefully about how we approach our mapping and our inferences about what the content of the universe is, given that we have two real coordinates for it, the direction on the sky, and then the pseudo third dimension, which is the redshift. And so perhaps if you've seen the recent talk about type 1a supernovae here, you'll recognize this Hubble diagram, it's so-called, because I believe it was first made by Hubble when he was plotting nearby galaxies to us and how they receded, and he showed that as a function of their Doppler shift, their redshift, and their distance, there was basically a line that they lined up along. As you go further away, you get this bigger Doppler shift, bigger redshift. But now, with experiments like DESI, we can push that to much, much more distant galaxies. And so when you do that, you start to see that the trends of distance versus redshift, so on this Hubble diagram, the line that you trace out becomes dependent upon what the exact contents of the universe are and how they interact with one another. If you're able to look far enough back in time, and so I don't want to go into too many details, but you can see this line splitting apart as you go to higher redshift and are looking further back in time. And so that's the kind of thing that DESI is after. But still, if you remember, we have the redshift, but where do we get the distance from? That is really the key part. So how can we calibrate the galaxy redshifts, which is what DESI is actually going to deliver to us from the telescope, into galaxy distances so that we can make our Hubble diagram like this? So this brings me to the concepts of standard candles and standard rulers, which are the usual ways that astronomers go about thinking about measuring distances of extragalactic objects. So again, going back to the type 1a supernovae you may have heard about that were used to first discover dark energy in the beginning of this whole field, those are what astronomers would refer to as standard candles. And by that we mean something that has a constant intrinsic brightness no matter where we see it in the universe. And so when astronomers studying supernovae look out and they get a spectrum to confirm that they actually have a supernova, they get its redshift, and then by assuming that it has a constant luminosity, they're able to also get its distance, and that's how they make their Hubble diagrams and infer the contents of the universe. And so, a simple way of thinking about this is something twice as far away from us will be 4 times fainter if it's a standard candle. So that's really all it is. That's actually not what DESI does. So DESI uses something called a standard ruler approach, and instead of trying to find something out there on the sky that has a constant brightness no matter where it is, in this case you're looking for something that has a standard physical size no matter where it is. And then the trick that you play is that if something with a fixed physical size gets moved twice as far away from you, then it looks half the size on the sky. And so that's how we do it. And that's how DESI is taking this approach to getting actual distances to complement its redshifts for galaxies. So to introduce one more acronym here, the specific type of standard ruler that DESI is going to be using is called BAO for short, Baryon Acoustic Oscillations. And I'll go very briefly into what this is in just a second, but in any case, it has a fixed physical size of 100 megaparsecs, mega meaning million, and parsec meaning about 3 light years. So this is huge, huge scales of the universe that we're talking about that you have to sort of map. You have to map as much of the universe as possible to really detect this and see this. We're talking about hundreds of millions of light years in size. And don't worry too much about the details of this plot, but it basically shows that as a function of redshift, which we measure, the size of this standard ruler called the BAO on the sky varies differently, the blue curve versus the green curve versus the white curve, depending on what the contents of the universe are. And just from this plot, you can kind of see a cartoon illustration of this, but prior experiments have been limited to relatively low redshift, where the lines seem to kind of overlap with one another a lot. DESI, for the first time, is pushing into this redshift 1 to 2 range that has never been explored before for dark energy, and where you can see that these lines start to diverge from each other, and you start to get a much better handle on what actually might be different about the different models and which matches best to what we actually see in the real universe. So just to try to give a little bit of insight into what the BAO is, you can think of it as ripples in the very early universe, just like droplets on a pond. So as I said before, the very early universe was much smaller, very dense, like a fluid, and there were small little overdensities in this fluid. And since it was so compact like a fluid, you could have just sound waves traveling through it, just like these ripples here in the water. And so you have this rippling going on in the early universe, and then at a certain point the universe expands to such an extent that things get spread out enough that it no longer behaves like a fluid. It's more like today, where everything is just separate from one another. And so when that happens, whatever ripples were left there were frozen in forever, and we can still see them to this day, and we can trace them now into the population of galaxies that we see on the sky with an experiment like DESI. This is my last slide. It's a little bit of a visual example of this. So you can think of this point here, which is emanating a wave, as a little bit of an overdense region in the early universe fluid. And there's many and many of these overdensities and underdensities in the early universe. They're all making these wave-like patterns, and they're all superimposed onto each other. Okay, so this is just sort of a plot of the density now. So this is kind of what we look at when we look out into the sky from, say, the Mail telescope at Kitt Peak. We see they're projected onto the sky now. There are these dense regions with little rings that are much lower in contrast surrounding them. And over time, as the first stars and galaxies form, what happens is that the galaxies start to preferentially populate the slightly overdense regions in these ripples that were frozen in very early in the universe. And so you can do a very simple thing in principle, which is to just take pairs of galaxies, all the pairs of galaxies that you measure in three-dimensional space, and ask how many of them are separated by each, physical separation scale. And so you can take all your pairs, this is a lot of pairs because we have something like 35 million galaxies, so it's like 35 million squared pairs. And if you make sort of a histogram of the frequency of how often galaxies are spaced out relative to one another, relative to sort of a random distribution, you get this special little peak right there, which is that ring you saw surrounding the overdensities in the early universe. So DESI will measure all these 35 million galaxies in order to make this very subtle statistical measurement of how often galaxies are separated by certain distances from one another, which gives you the BAO length scale and can tell you how to infer the contents of the universe. So with that, I'll turn it over now to Parker to tell you more about the hardware details, which are really cool. Are we going to do this? I don't know.
I guess so. How does it work?
Or we can try this.
You can bend it around your ear.
Okay, yeah, I have a tiny ear. It might fall. Yeah, maybe that works.
Yeah, sure.
You hear me? Yeah? Okay. Let me get my computer. Thanks. All right, great. Well, thanks for having us tonight. Aaron basically talked to you about the dark energy part of DESI, and I'm going to try to talk a little bit more about the spectroscopic instrument part of this. And as Aaron mentioned several times, our goal is to understand the cosmic history of the universe. But the way we get there is by measuring the redshift of 35 million galaxies. So I'm going to focus on how do we get the redshift of 35 billion galaxies. And then once we have that, we can do all of the very cool science, etc. But let's drill into how we even get there. So for a very basic first step, what is an instrument? Sometimes when I am up at Kitt Peak and I go on the tours, there's a lack of distinction between what's the telescope and what's the instrument. Is DESI the whole thing, or DESI just a part of it? The telescope, the 4-meter Mail telescope, is essentially like a light bucket. And it could dump that light into any instrument you want. Often, instruments are just going to be cameras, CCDs, taking pictures. But sometimes they're spectrographs, sometimes they're even different types of instruments. So the telescope is the light bucket. The instrument is something that measures the light in a very specific way for specific science goals. And so, since our science goal is to measure the spectroscopic redshift, we use spectrographs. So that's why we have spectroscopy. But essentially what I'm trying to say here is that the instrument is unique from the telescope. And so what I'm going to talk about is the thing that we put on the Mail actually very recently, within the last 6 months to a year. And the reason we wanted to do this is because we wanted more spectra. This isn't the first large spectroscopic survey that's been done, but it's going to be by far the largest. The one that was done most recently, that was the largest, is called BAO, a BAO spectroscopic survey. And what you see here is an aluminum plate with holes drilled in it. There are 1,000 holes. And you see a person actually plugging each one of those holes with an individual fiber. And they plugged up to 3,000 fibers over the lifetime of the project so that they could, not 3,000, I'm sorry, 3 million. And someone said, well, let's go up from 1,000 to 5,000. They're like, no, I'm not going to plug 5,000 fibers into a plate, right? So we had to come up with a new idea. If we wanted more spectra, we weren't going to be able to use these aluminum plates anymore. And so DESI used to be called Big Boss, which is a much cooler name, but they didn't ask me. But anyways, DESI is essentially Big Boss, but it's going to be an order of magnitude larger in data, and up to 35 million galaxies and quasars, unlike BOSS, which is also called SDSS-3, which is about 3 million galaxies. So we're really pushing the envelope with this instrument. So this is kind of an overview of where the photons go. So I said that the telescope is essentially a light bucket. The bucket part of it sits right here. That's where the primary mirror is, the 4-meter primary. How many of you guys have been up to Kitt Peak and seen the Mail? Excellent, great. I recommend going in about 2 months. We're going to have a really great DESI exhibit there then. But I'm glad everyone has seen this at least one time. So the light bucket sends the light up into the instrument, which is up here at the focal point of the telescope. It first goes through some optics. We have 6 approximately 1 meter wide optics that corrects light for any kind of aberrations as it's going to our focal surface. So it goes through a bunch of lenses into our focal surface here, which is comprised of 5,000 fibers. But these fibers aren't drilled into plates. They're connected to robots. And the robots are able to move those fibers anywhere within the focal surface. So the light enters the fibers up here, but then they travel all the way down the telescope, about 40 meters, and then they're plugged into spectrographs, where the light is spread out, similar way as a prism, and we get a spectrum. So this is what the whole thing is there for, so we can get these spectra at the end of the day. So I'm going to go into more detail on kind of each one of these steps. So if you guys have been up to Kitt Peak, then you've seen the 4-meter. It's beautiful, huge, but we had to take the top ring off of it. The instruments before were smaller and needed different kinds of connecting devices, essentially. So we had to take it off. So this is the old ring and the old corrector that was used in the past. They couldn't actually take it out through the telescope. It was too large, so they had to hire this enormous crane. You can imagine how big this is if you've been up there and seen the telescope. And so this is the new ring for DESI. It's larger and lighter. And then, okay, so then we've got 6 of these. Well, how do we put those on there? It looks like this in the end. So this is what we call the corrector. It has 6 of those lenses inside. And these right here, kind of the silver parts right there, it's called the hexapod. And what that does is when the telescope moves or when the temperature changes for any reason, things do change. They can shrink or expand only so slightly, but only so slightly is enough for you to kind of veer off of the galaxy you're trying to look at. So these hexapods flex all 6 of the lenses so that we get a perfect image every single time. And this is all linked into the software. It's automatically done, but it's kind of even hard for me to imagine those 1 meter pieces of glass, wide pieces of glass, being moved and tweaked ever so slightly by this hexapod. It's quite a beautiful concept, I think. So this was the very first thing we put on. This corrector took years and years and years to make. Each one of these lenses had to be polished, and each has a unique shape. They're not exactly the same. And so actually it's the very first thing that was purchased on, for DESI, and it turned out just beautifully. But it's a one-of-a-kind, probably the most expensive part of DESI, really. And so this was put on first. Then comes the focal plane and our 5,000 robotic positioners. So the way we've split it up is into 10 petals, we call them, so 10 unique slices. They're all identical. So each petal has 500 robotic positioners and either a guide or a focus camera. So there are 10 cameras surrounding the focal plate, and we use some of them to track where we are on the sky, and we use some of them to tell us if we are in focus or not. That's what the camera looks like right there. You can kind of see on the as-built focal plane. So we installed each one of these petals individually, and each one of them is connected to its own spectrograph. So we almost in some way have 10 sub-assemblies or sub-instruments on the telescope that are all very closely linked. So these robots, sometimes people are disappointed when you say, oh yeah, DESI has robots, and then I show them it's just a couple motors. They are still very cool, but they don't maybe spark the imagination as much as some people would prefer. Okay, but this is how they work. Here's the fiber at the very tip. You can kind of see it right here. And the fiber is 100 microns wide, so just a couple hairs wide, so very small, very hard to handle. It is glued into a little piece of glass at the very tip here, where it's held onto by the positioner. Then the fiber runs all the way through the positioner and eventually down to the spectrographs. There are two different motors. We call a theta and a phi motor, but basically one rotates like this and then the other is off to the side. And this positioner is able to put that 100 micron fiber anywhere within a 12 millimeter diameter circle. And these circles overlap so that we can get every single space on the focal plane. In order to accomplish that, we have something called anti-collision. We don't want them bumping into each other. So if we want them to go very close to each other, they have to go through a series of moves to help them get there. So I'm going to show a video on how these move. I'll show it a couple times because... Oh, here we go. It's on my screen. Okay. Okay. Oh, sorry. Here we go. All right. I will show it one more time. So, essentially, what that allows us to do, I'm sorry, now I can't get this out of the way. How do I get out of here? Okay. There we go. And, okay. So what that allows us to do is reposition all of the fibers within about a minute and a half. So you can imagine we're looking at 5,000 galaxies, stare at it for about 20 minutes, move to another part on the sky, move the positioners, then a minute and a half, and look at 5,000 new galaxies. So that's how we get to 35 million. I'm going to step through a little bit slower on how we actually line them up with galaxies. Okay, I'm sorry, I thought that this would go a little smoother. But isn't that always the case? Whenever you play a video, it never actually goes how you want it to. There we go. All right, here we are. Okay, so I'm going to slowly walk you through the process of how we get fibers aligned with galaxies. The very first step is to select a field on the sky that we want that has about 5,000 galaxies in it, and move the telescope to that area. So we're going to know that ahead of time. We've already pre-selected all those galaxies. Once we get to that field, we're going to take an image with a guide camera, like the one I showed you a couple slides ago. We take a picture. There's a bunch of galaxies and or stars. We're actually mostly looking for stars in this case because we want something bright to hang on to. Now, there have been many missions, both space missions and ground missions, that have gone through and measured very precisely the location of all stars. So we don't have to do that work. But what we can do is match up what we see to their catalogs. So basically, when we take a picture of the sky with our guide cameras, we can tell exactly what we're looking at. So we take a picture, we identify the guide stars exactly, and then we know exactly where we're looking in space. And we start guiding on that. We make sure that the telescope keeps looking at that as we move relative to the sky. Okay. It's very important then to convert the location of targets to location on the focal plate. So we identify the location of galaxies and stars, everything in astronomy, with the right ascension and declination. It's essentially latitude and longitude for the sky. And we want to map that onto our fibers. So we need to do a transformation of what we're seeing in the sky to where we put the fibers. So we make that transformation. It can all be done using math, but you need to know exactly where you're looking in space to be able to tell the fibers where to go. So we move the fibers to where they're supposed to go on the focal plane, and then we backlight them. Instead of having light go down the fibers, we put light back the other way. And we take a picture of that. We have a camera that can look right at the focal plane. And the picture of the focal plane, right, I have a picture right here. So this is one petal. Sorry the contrast, but I think we can see it all right here. So you can see that the fibers on the left are in a different location than the fibers on the right. No, not as much, but yeah. And so this camera will tell us if we're pointed in the right direction or not. We're probably pretty close, but pretty close when it comes to this kind of precision isn't good enough. We need to be within 5 microns of where we told it to go. So we take a picture of it and say, close but not quite, move a little bit to the left, move a little to the right. And so it goes through a correction move. We take another picture and they say, that's great. You should be right on target. We turn off the lights and then we let the light from the galaxies come down the fibers. And the fibers make their ways all the way down to the spectrographs, and we expose on the spectrographs for about 20 minutes, and that should be enough light for us to determine a spectra or a redshift, spectroscopic redshift for that galaxy. So again, the process is you take a picture of the sky, it tells you where you are, and then you use that information to tell the fibers where to go. And the fibers move a couple times to line up exactly with the galaxies, and then you're able to get the galaxy light down the fibers.
Parker, what's your field of view on that?
Well, the field of view of all of DESI is 3 degrees diameter, right? So it's approximately 8 square degrees. Okay, and then this is an example spectrograph exposure. So we have 10 different spectrographs, and I'll show you a little bit more what those look like. But so 500 fibers, the light from 500 fibers are on this one exposure right here, where the light is chopped up in the wavelength direction, and then we have 500 unique fibers. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about the optical fibers, because it's also a very neat part of the project. When we installed the positioners into the focal plate, we installed them with just about 3 meters of fiber, because we couldn't, you have to install the positioners into the focal plate from the front, not from the back. And because of that, we couldn't feed 40 meters of fiber through the focal plate, which is an aluminum structure. So we attached 3 meters of fiber to the positioner, installed that, and then essentially glued or melted that fiber to the 40 meters that goes down to the spectrograph. So you can see here, the fibers are covered for protection, something called polyamide. And so we strip some of that off of the fiber. We take 2 of the fibers and chop them very, very precisely using a diamond blade. And then we glue them together. And if you can't see that that's 2 different fibers, then and neither can I. So it works quite well. And it's actually the first time this has ever been done for astronomy. Mostly people use connectors. The reason we didn't want to use connectors is there's throughput loss. We're trying to get every last photon out of these. So we're coming up with novel ideas for how to get as many photons from the galaxies down to our spectrographs. This is what the back end of the focal plane looks like. So each one of these petals, you can kind of count 10 of them here, has the 500 positioners, also has 500 fibers. So each one of these big, bulky black cables contains 500 fibers. And that's what's taken all the way down the telescope here. It has to be hardy enough that it can handle rotations of the telescope, but it's also carrying very delicate fibers. So there has to be some additional fiber inside of it so it can move around if needed. Okay, and then once it gets down into the spectrographs, we need some way to get the fiber light into the spectrographs. So we splay them all out like this. So once they come out the other end, we line them all out very carefully in a straight line so they're all on the same focus. And so the light coming out of the end here is what would go into the spectrograph. So we would have one of these for each individual spectrograph. So like I've said a couple of times, we have 10 unique spectrographs on DESI, and we had to make a special room for them. CCDs, cameras, detectors do better in colder environments, but more importantly, stable environments. So we created this little house within the Mail telescope to make sure that everything is thermally stable. Each one of the spectrographs has 3 channels, and that means there are 3 different kinds of detectors in the spectrograph. So we have blue, we have red, and we have infrared. So a little bit past what we can see near infrared. The reason we have 3 different detectors is because we are trying to measure the redshift of galaxies close by all the way to very far away. And these things are moving away from us, so their spectral lines also move in redshift. So we need to be able to cover a large wavelength range. And as you guys probably know, I mean, many people are photographers these days. Regular CCDs have a limited wavelength range. You can only see certain things, certain colors. And so we need different materials in our detectors to be able to detect different types of lines. So that's why we have the 3 different types of detectors. So the light comes in from the fibers, gets split up 3 ways equally, and then from there gets spread out into the spectrograph with some kind of prism-like object. Okay, so that's the hardware, but nothing really gets done anymore without software. And often get asked, I'm sure Aaron does too, like, well, what's it like to be an astronomer? At the Mail telescope, there are a couple dark rooms, which is very cool, where people would just run with their glass plates, into the dark room right away. I have never done anything close to that, right? I prefer being in a very warm room. I don't want to be out there in the cold. So this is really what it looks like to be an astronomer these days. But it's more than just yourself on a laptop, especially with an instrument as complicated as DESI. So we have a fairly lean team, I would say, for something as complicated as we do, but we have a couple dozen people that are required to get all of this done, because not everyone can be an expert in everything else. And the thing that ties it all together is the software. And there are a couple different levels of software. There's one type of software that runs the instrument, tells it what to do, and has everything operating. The other is dealing with the data. And I'm not sure that you can completely call DESI big data, but it's on the edge there, certainly. We're pushing some limits here. So about every year, we'll have approximately 10 terabytes of data that goes from Kitt Peak to a supercomputer in Berkeley called NERSC. And when it's at NERSC, that's when it's going to be really refined, help us define the redshift. There's many different layers to dealing with the raw data to get it into a form that means something, something you can read. And so going from 10 terabytes a year of raw data, it will turn into about 100 terabytes a year of actual products that we can use for science. And so this will be released publicly every year for 5 years. So hopefully in about a year from now, we will have our first public release of data. And one other thing I should note is one unique thing about DESI is because we have so many galaxies to observe, we need to be extremely efficient. Now, when an observer comes in for just a couple nights, they kind of all have to start from scratch. But we have the benefit on DESI of getting every night on the Mayall for the next 5 years. We don't have to compete with anybody. Well, that simplifies a lot of things for us, but it also means that we want to set up processes that are extremely efficient. And so all of our focus of the telescope is done automatically. The picking of targets will be done automatically. So this whole thing will move almost on its own without human interaction in a lot of ways. That would be best. But there are always things to fix, so our jobs are secure for a while, I think. But we are on Sky, so it's extremely exciting to have built this instrument and now see it's actually working. We're not just talking about it anymore. So in October, we had what we called first light. It was first light through our fibers to our spectrographs. There's one caveat with this. We didn't actually move the positioners in this case, but we went and looked at a galaxy that was big enough that we didn't have to move the fibers. We were going to get cool galaxy light down the fibers even by not moving them. And so we first looked at this triangulum galaxy, M33, and this is a spectra that came out of it. So we have the 3 different detectors. We have a blue detector, a red detector, and an infrared detector. And these lines are identifying unique spectral features from that galaxy, which can be used to determine the redshift of that galaxy. Now, this galaxy is quite close to us, so that's not particularly scientifically interesting, but we have great signal to noise, and the spectra look very nice. We also looked at the California Nebula, and what you're seeing here is in the background just a nice image of the California Nebula. And then here, it is picking out a certain part of the spectra in each fiber. So it just shows that there's more of that element in this area than in those. So it was an exciting experiment. But since then, we've started moving positioners. We are getting them aligned with targets within 5 microns, just like we planned. And I am very happy to say that because it wasn't a given. And so this is an actual spectra that we got of quite a distant galaxy using a positioner that was actually moved. And so we're just starting now. We are in a phase called commissioning, and that's basically just get the instrument to work. Make sure that the hardware talks to the software. That's what commissioning is. The next part that we're about to enter is called survey validation. And that's, okay, well, we can take data, but were all of our expectations for how long it would take and what types of objects we should look at, are those all, were they good decisions? Do we need to modify them? So we'll do our survey validation over the next few months, and then we'll start 5 years of the regular DESI survey. So that is literally right around the corner, which is why we have this collaboration meeting. First of all, the DESI collaboration has about 600 people and 69 participating institutions. It's a big collaboration. But so Aaron and I are both physicists. We like to work with the hardware and kind of get things going. But a lot of the collaborators are just want the data. So they're all very excited that we're finally getting the data and can finally start doing some science. So we're getting a lot of excitement with the members and hoping to take that forward. So with that, I will stop. Please visit desi.lbl.gov. It is our website. It has a lot of other resources and information about the instrument and the science and all that. And again, I'd like to thank the sponsors, but also the whole DESI collaboration. So, thank you.
And thank you, Aaron. Aaron also has a microphone now. We'll be happy to take any questions that you might have. We have questions at the back of the room.
Aaron, do you want to?
Sure.
I was wondering if one of you could comment on the theory of massive gravity that's been proposed as an explanation for dark energy, and if what you're doing would do anything to either validate it or invalidate it.
Yeah, well, that was loud this time. I'm going to interpret it essentially as getting towards what can DESI say about the theory of gravity because of the way that it maps the universe on such large scales. And yes, DESI will be able to probe whether there are or what we would call deviations from Einstein's theory of general relativity. Because if you think back to those pictures I showed where we're essentially mapping out on very huge scales how the cosmic web grows and looks, it would look different if gravity was behaving differently. Things would collapse together in different ways and be filamentary in subtly different ways. And so that is one of the motivations for DESI, is to try to see if a signature like that can be picked up by getting such a huge number of galaxies.
Question up here.
Yeah, the redshift, I believe, was discovered sometime in the 1930s and observed. Now you guys are doing study of the redshift. Why are you spending billions of dollars doing it now? What's the reason?
Yeah, one thing I would note is that DESI is not a billion-dollar experiment. DESI is actually an extremely lean experiment considering how ambitious its goals are. So there are billion-dollar astronomy projects today like James Webb, that's of order 10 billion. The Vera Rubin Observatory, which is also in Tucson, is of order $1 billion, I believe, although I'm not part of that. DESI is something like 1/20th or 1/10 of that. So DESI is an incredibly cost-efficient mission, I would say. And if we had a better way of measuring distances to galaxies, I think we would try it. But redshift is still the best way. We're still looking at light and visible wavelengths, right? That's how people have done it for hundreds of years. So in some ways, it's very antiquated, but in a lot of ways, it's very cutting edge. So I think that's kind of what's cool about it, is that it's just visible light astronomy opening up a telescope onto the sky, but at the same time, there's all this cool technology Parker described to do it. So,
Additionally, sorry, just to follow up real quick. Additionally, what we will get out of DESI is not only a greater understanding of the cosmic history, but also we will have 35 million spectra of galaxies. And the amount of astronomy and science that can be done with that on its own is incredible. Basically, what questions are we not asking? That might be one of the most interesting things that comes out of DESI. That happened with BOSS. An incredible amount of science was able to be done with that data set, even though its purpose was to study dark energy. So we will get way more out of DESI than just redshifts.
We have a question here.
Yeah, how do you determine the 5,000 galaxies you're going to look at, since it's predetermined before you actually do it? Second question is that for my ignorance, BAO, what does Banyan refer to in terms of what it means?
You mean baryon? Baryon.
Okay,
I believe the word was baryon.
do you want to take it out?
Well, it's nice of him to let me take it because he did a lot of the work, but before DESI, we had an imaging survey using the Mail telescope, the Blanco telescope in Chile, and the Bach telescope up at Kitt Peak. So 3 different telescopes we used to do a huge imaging survey to help us identify all of the targets. And while we can't tell from one picture like Aaron showed whether something's a star or a galaxy, you can start making those differentiations by using different filters. So we used several filters with the images we took of the sky, and we also used WISE infrared data to help us further identify whether something was a galaxy or not. So that gave us essentially the 2D map that we needed to start with. And all of that data is available to the public as well. So we have pre-identified all of them and identified which kinds of galaxies should be identifiable at what redshift ranges. And the survey validation should hopefully tell us whether or not we were correct.
Yeah, one other comment on the target selection that Parker was saying, but just to select these 35 million galaxies that DESI is going to look at, we did over 1,000 nights of special observations over the course of the past few years just to even select the target. So that was a huge effort. I did something like 40 nights. Parker probably a similar number.
So,
Could you say something about that acronym BAO?
Yeah, I was actually, that was actually a very good question, and I should have clarified that better in my talk. But when I talked about quote-unquote normal matter, like the atoms and the protons and the electrons, the physicist term for that is baryon. And so that's where the B, the baryon, and baryon acoustic oscillations comes from.
the acoustic comes from the fact that in the very early universe, it was essentially a plasma-type liquid of photons and baryonic matter all mixed up. And the speed of the fluctuations through that measure traveled at essentially the speed of sound. So that's why acoustic oscillations. The distance between the center point and the ring in the oscillation was traveled in the speed of sound.
You have a question over here.
In the images that show the web-like structure of the large scale of the universe, does each speck of light represent a galaxy or a cluster of galaxies?
Yeah, so I think it may actually depend on the visualization, but I think for the most part, because there were different visualizations in there, I think for the most part they were single galaxies in there, and then you could see them clumping up together into galaxy clusters where the different filaments intersected one another.
Do we have any other questions? Oh, yes, down here.
Actually, two questions. How did you decide which of 35 million you wanted to look at? What was the criteria for choosing that? And can you explain a little bit more about how those optical fibers actually absorb the light? They're not cameras, obviously. How do they absorb, basically register the light?
I guess I can take the one about the targets, and then Parker is the expert on the fiber, so I assume she'll take that one. But as I mentioned, we did this 1,000 nights of pre-observing to select the targets, and then we do have very specific predefined types of targets that we're going to look at. So for example, we can tell what's a star and what's a galaxy. So like when the moon is up and it's bright, or conditions are bad, we're going to get 10 million stars actually in the Milky Way, which will be very interesting for studying our own galaxy. And then some examples of the different target classes of the external galaxies that are very distant that we'll look at. They're the so-called quasars, which I sort of touched on, which are very luminous, and so they're galaxies that you can see that are bright but still very, very far away. Another class is called luminous red galaxies, and they're kind of exactly what they sound like. They're these sort of fuzzy reddish objects that you look at in your image, and they're passive red-looking galaxies basically, and those are very good for tracing the structure of the cosmic web as well.
I'll mention really quickly, so optical fibers are great ways to transfer information from one place to another. I believe that there are optical fibers underneath the ocean kind of connecting Europe to the US. I don't know how they did that. But essentially the optical fiber, it's flat at the front and the light comes in just as if it's focused on the front of the fiber, and then it bounces all the way down to the 40 meters. It comes out the other end almost exactly the way it came in. And once it comes out the other end, it enters the spectrograph. And the spectrograph has several different elements. It has a dispersing element, like a prism, and it has detectors. So you spread out the light, and then the detectors is where it finally falls and is recorded.
There was another question down here? It was over here.
What's the greatest redshift you expect to detect?
Yeah, so DESI isn't really designed to, try to set a record redshift, but I believe we'll have some relatively high redshift quasars in the sort of redshift 5 range. That will be one of the smaller target classes. We're not going to find 35 million of those, but we'll maybe every pointing get 1 or 2 of them or something like that. So in the 5-ish ballpark. But DESI is not optimized to set the new record for highest redshift, unfortunately.
We'll have many redshift of 3 quasars.
Yes, what are the top 3 things that we don't know today that within a year or so you expect to discover and we'll hear about it?
So dark energy is sometimes described as a cosmological constant. It was something in Einstein's general relativity. It was a fudge factor he put in his equations to make it work. And then, decades later, we find that maybe that fudge factor actually is something physical. Maybe it is dark energy. But dark energy can only be the cosmological constant if it does not change in time or space. So that's one thing we want to make sure of with DESI. Does dark energy change in time or space? If it does, then it's not the cosmological constant. If it doesn't, then yeah, general relativity is a very good description of gravity. We're pretty sure it's a cosmological constant. So if you found out that it wasn't, the dark energy did change with time and space, I believe that the astronomical community would be extremely surprised.
I think going back to something Parker just touched on, but the idea of these quasars at redshift 2 to 3, there have been some very preliminary measurements of that with Sloan, that this is sort of a new frontier going out to that higher redshift for dark energy. And they show some sort of interesting, very low significance tensions. And so DESI is really going to tell us if that tension at the highest redshifts is real or not. And so that's one of the big, potentially exciting discoveries. And then I don't want to take Parker's opportunity to say number 3, but my number 3 I would leave it for a wild card, because we're going to have 35 million objects, and my personal interest, honestly, I'm more of an astronomer. I just want to kind of know what's the weirdest, most unusual thing we find, and I bet that'll make some sort of headlines.
Probably be something you don't even know right now. It's going to be the big discovery. Yeah. All right. So, telescope is closed tonight. However, a week from tonight, we will have our semi-annual lecture in Spanish. If you understand Spanish or you're learning Spanish, come join us and learn about extrasolar planets. And then our next English language lecture will be on March the 30th, which would be 3 weeks from today. And that is Dr. Vivian Miranda. And she will tell us about using polarimetry to deal with some of these cosmological problems. That will be on the 30th of March. Let's thank Dr. Meisner and Dr. Fagrelius again.